As we continue to think of trigonometric functions as functions, we will pick up another set of identities called the even and odd identities, which relate back to our concept of even functions and odd functions. Now, to begin this conversation, let's look at a warm-up. In this warm-up, we have sine of pi over 3, which we should know to be the square root of 3 over 2. In part B, we have the sine of negative pi over 3. So, with the sine of negative pi over 3, remember that the reference angle is pi over 3, but for negative pi over 3, that will be in quadrant 4. So, sine of negative pi over 3 is going to have the same magnitude as the sine of pi over 3, but because our angle is in the fourth quadrant, sine of theta is going to be negative in the fourth quadrant. So as we look at part C, cosine of pi over 3, we know that angle has a cosine of positive a half. And again, this is going to have the same, in part D, the same reference angle and the same quadrant as what we saw as sine of negative pi over 3, same angle. So the magnitude of the cosine of negative pi over 3 will be 1/2, and since negative pi over 3 is in quadrant 4, cosine of negative pi over 3 will be positive. So we have positive a half. So notice we have sine of pi over 3 and sine of negative pi over 3 are not the same. In fact, if we look at the sine of negative pi over 3, that is the same thing as the sine of pi over 3, but it's negative. So this might remind you of f of negative x is equal to negative f of x. So let's look now at cosine. With cosine of negative pi over 3, these two are the same. So here this is reminiscent of f of negative x equals f of x. If you remember, functions that obey the first property, f of negative x equals negative f of x, these are odd functions. Cosine, however, is an even function. So this yields for us 6 new identities, the even and odd identities. We've already seen that sine is an odd function, and its reciprocal then will be an odd function. Cosine, we have seen, is an even function. Its reciprocal then will be even. Tangent functions are odd as well as sine functions. And cotangent, the reciprocal of tangent, will be then an odd function also. So here are 6 more identities for you to memorize. So let's use these identities to evaluate some trig functions. Sine of negative 30 degrees, well, sine is an odd function. So I can find the sine of 30 degrees, and then because sine is odd, I can find the opposite of that, sine of 30 degrees. Sine of 30 degrees is 1/2 from what I have memorized from my 30, 60, 90 right triangles. And we have negative 1/2. For cosine of negative 45 degrees, well, cosine functions are even functions. So therefore, this will be the same thing as just cosine of 45 degrees. But cosine of 45 degrees is the square root of 2 over 2. And for our last example, cotangent of negative pi over 3. Well, cotangent is an odd function, So this will be the same thing as negative cotangent of pi over 3. Now, one thing that I want to remind you of with our even and odd functions is this negative is not getting factored out. This negative is not the same as that negative, especially when it comes to even functions, because in an even function, this negative is removed on the outside. It's an odd function that there's a negative on the outside. So don't think that this negative is the same as that negative, because it's not. So what is the cotangent of pi over 3? Well, you may not remember it off the top of your heads, so tangent of pi over 3 we know to be the square root of 3. That is something you should have memorized. So the cotangent of pi over 3 will be the reciprocal. So it'll be root 3 over 3, and then because of that negative, we'll have negative root 3 over 3 for our final answer.